Throughout history, mental cognition in humans has been notoriously known to decrease over time. As you age, your body ages with you, leading to decreases in physical abilities such as balance and strength, as well as mental capabilities. With cognitive and physical decrease come symptoms that can seriously affect driving capabilities. Driving requires one to be alert, quick thinking, well-sighted, and able to pay attention to multiple actions in and out of the car. With the knowledge of aging, cognition depletion, and the needed ability to drive, comes controversy with elderly drivers. Throughout this essay, the statistical effects of elderly drivers will be explored, as well as exploring the possibility of testing drivers as they ensure more safety on the road. Statistically speaking, elderly drivers are not the number one concern when it comes to the safety of drivers and other people on the road. Typically, teen drivers are the most reckless and irresponsible drivers. This makes sense because teens are the newest to the road with the least amount of experience, not to mention they still aren't fully cognitively developed. Though the percentage of teen drivers causing crashes is higher than elderly drivers causing crashes, the damage caused by elderly drivers is a concern of its own. David Longrow, Seth Seabury, Laura Zachris of RAND Corporations conducted a study of fragility of elderly drivers. As people got older, their fragility significantly increased, indicating that the drivers themselves were much more likely to get hurt in car accidents as opposed to younger people. With the fragility rates of elderly drivers rising exponentially, the risk factors for them increases that much more. If a driver was to get into a wreck and they were already very fragile, their possible injuries could be much more significant and potentially fatal. This further argues how drivers should be tested as they get older for the health of not only the other drivers on the road, but the driver themselves. If you start a conversation with someone about elderly drivers, the usual response that you'll receive is at least some bit negative. I would say that almost every driver has had a bad experience involving an older driver. Whether that is getting cut off, a driver going too slow, getting hit, small or minor, it's a frustrating experience to deal with elderly drivers. This is again due to the delayed cognition that is simply caused by aging. The questionnaire concluded that 75.7% of those interviewed agreed that at a certain age, elderly drivers should be required to retest or complete a training in order to maintain their license. This is a large percentage and is also the highest agreed upon question asked in the survey. With such a high percentage of agreement, the commonality of the idea of retesting for older drivers at a certain age is a prominent idea in many minds. This alone shows the public perspective on elderly drivers. With that being said, the argument for a retesting age is quite prominent within our society. This is most likely due to ageism. Ageism is the discrimination of people based on their age. It is reasonable to understand how people would have a negative connotation to the idea of people not allowing for someone to have the ability to drive simply because of their age. However, although the conversation around people's ages can be difficult, it doesn't necessarily mean that the conversation shouldn't be had for the sake of the safety for all. As lawmaking concerning the general population for drivers has enhanced over time, the increase in concern about elderly drivers has risen. Car crashes that involve elderly people are typically high-profile cases because of the kind of attention that they attract from the citizens, which can eventually lead to government action. For example, in Points of View, Elderly Drivers by Michael P. Auerbach, there were 2 cases in Massachusetts that caused the state to start requiring residents 75 years and older to visit an RMV and pass a vision test every 5 years rather than the previous 10-year renewal period. The article also later states that there have been more regulations for elderly drivers put in place in the D.C. area, though the laws are not yet spanned countrywide. With that being said, regulations can be put in place to prevent accidents, though having attention put on a specific accident is the main factor that creates change. The new testing regulations have only begun to be placed on local levels, yet in the future there is potential for even state or national levels. With the cognitive and physical ability of a person starting to deteriorate over time, a person may become impaired, making it hard and unsafe for them to drive. Elders' physical strength over time decreases along with mental cognition. Between 6.7 to 25.2% of the general population age 60 have mild cognitive impairment. Mild cognitive impairment is essentially the process of losing one's memory as well as visual and spatial perception, which are all essential components to driving. Though the percentage of elderly drivers with MCI may not seem terribly high, the statistic is only for one age and the percentage range is broad. Not every person who is age 60 and above suffers from MCI or Alzheimer's disease. However, the precaution of retesting older adults is a much better option than an accident due to slowed reaction time. The age requirement for retesting should be set at 65 years of age and should apply to every driver to ensure everyone's safety. An elderly person may not necessarily have MCI, but aging also causes some form of cognition depletion regardless, which would make the testing even more necessary. Many people believe that when it comes to deciding whether a driver should stop driving due to age and ability, that it should be based on a family's opinion rather than the government's. In an NPR article, Neil Conan and a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Elizabeth Dugan, discuss how taking away one's driving skills is stripping them of their independence, as well as making them completely dependent on someone else to take them anywhere, which can be a very difficult conversation. Dugan discusses her own personal experiences with her own mother on how when they are with her they choose to drive her because her mother gets lost and tends to forget things as of current. She also later concludes that driving tests are by state and some have a medical record component while some don't. She was able to use her own personal example and empathize with her mother while also understanding that it is no longer safe for her mother or the people driving around her. Understanding that it is important to empathize with the elderly drivers is a crucial element when discussing taking away their driving ability. With this said, safety of the driver and people around them should always be prioritized. In the case of the family addressing the issue of the member of their family driving when they shouldn't be, it isn't always the most comforting situation. Many people can get defensive about the topic and can feel like they are having a sense of freedom taken away from them, or just get defensive because they don't want to accept the truth of the situation. With having a family in charge of taking the keys, regulations aren't necessarily put in place and it could go in a negative direction. The act of having a law in place for retesting at a certain age and regulating it every 5 years, there's a definite system in place and there are legal consequences if not followed rather than just hiding keys. Far too often, people end up getting into a terrible car accident before they recognize or accept that they need to stop driving. That being said, having family members being responsible for determining when their elder family member needs to stop driving is also not reliable. Who's to say that the family member in charge of taking away car keys is reliable enough to determine such a decision, further proving the point that there should be regulations in place legally. With being a relatively new driver myself, fitting into the statistics of a driver within the teenage group doesn't set me up to seem like I would be a very good driver. I wouldn't say that I'm a great driver, saying that I've only had my license for 2 years, but I definitely attempt to drive my safest and best I can. In December 2023, I was turning right on a green light when I was T-boned by a man in his 80s driving a pickup truck. He was turning left on a red light and had completely missed the lane he was meant to turn into. The accident could have been avoided completely if he had paid more attention, or was able to pay more attention. The response in his brain said, "I don't see a car there," when there was in fact a car there, or the thought of the car being there was completely delayed. Both vehicles were totaled, and I was sent to the hospital due to the injuries I received from the impact of the crash. Having had such a scary experience with an older driver so recently, understanding the impact of these types of drivers fuels my advocacy for regulations to be put in place. With having a personal wreck experience caused by a negligent elderly driver, the prevalence of having laws put in place is greatly shown. Operating a vehicle without having the full cognitive ability to do so is very reckless. To create a comparison, think about drunk driving. When one drinks an excessive amount, their cognition is delayed as well as their motor function, making putting them behind a wheel extremely dangerous. No one bats an eye when people say that drunk driving is bad and it is extremely illegal, making some people go to jail for the rest of their lives. It causes many accidents and deaths every year. Yes, accidents may happen, but age plays a major role in what goes on in a wreck involving an elderly person, especially if they are the primary one at fault. With regulations put in place to help avoid accidents, many people can become more cautious and aware. Having regulations put in place with elderly drivers can also make the system less neglectful of the issues at hand. Not only will the roads feel safer, the percentage of accidents involving the elderly will drop significantly.